Today we're going to talk about some enhancements that we're bringing out in 10.7. So 10.5.10.6, we've added in some previous capabilities such as the VLAN extend method with user-based tunneling. Now we're adding in a couple more features into this. So we'll do an overview, go over some of the use cases, some of the details and caveats, configuration, best practices, troubleshooting, and then I'll cover everything and show you in real time over a demo. So two of the new features that we brought in, these actually came in a later 10.6 release, but we wanted to make sure we're fully covered here in 10.7 so that you're fully aware of it and can use it in your customer implementations, as well as if it comes up in a customer implementation for troubleshooting sessions or anything like that. So we have the user-based tunneling downloadable gateway role now with AOS-CX. It works differently than AOS switch that you may be familiar with that you had previously used with AOS switch, as well as we brought in multi-zone, the capability to tunnel to multiple clusters or gateways. So let's first talk about the downloadable gateway role. One of the major differences that we have between this and the AOS switch implementation is that it bypasses the switch user role. So no longer do we need to use the tunneling command in the gateway user role to kick off the tunnel. It's done by using new VSAs that have been introduced that automatically indicates the gateway, which zone and which role that the gateway will download. The tunnel traffic will use on the switch and be pointed to, which indicates basically the tunneling profile of the gateway that tunnel traffic will go to, and then which role or enforcement profile from ClearPass that the gateway will download. So we have two new VSAs for that, and this was supported and introduced with 10.6.100. Now with multi-zone, we now have the capability to tunnel to a separate gateway cluster. So we can now tunnel to multiple clusters from a single switch. This has been a big ask for a few years now since we've introduced user-based tunneling. But these zones can be configured for separate VRFs, and it allows us to keep the traffic separate from the rest of the infrastructure for certain use cases. And this is also supported and introduced with CX 10.6.100 or later. So some of the reasons for this, the downloadable gateway role is really a nice feature to have because it eliminates a lot of the static configuration that you need to do across all the gateways. You know, for the very much larger environments, enterprise environments that they have multiple clusters around their network, if you have to deal with those roles that exist on those clusters, you have to configure all of those and make sure they're consistent across the entire infrastructure. So the downloadable gateway role eliminates that need by allowing all that configuration now to exist in ClearPath. And then those gateway roles can be downloaded dynamically as the users are tunneled to those gateways. Primary use case for this would be when all clients across the network that will be wired are tunneled to a gateway. So every single client on the network is going to be tunneled to a gateway, because there's some caveats around how it works with downloadable switch roles. So there's some caveats that we're working on enhancing, but for now, one of the main use cases is if you're tunneling all clients to a gateway, that's where you would use the gateway role, as I'll show in just a minute. For multi-zone, one of the primary drivers for that is that it keeps specific tunnel traffic separate from the rest of the enterprise. For instance, guest traffic or vendor traffic, you might want to keep that separate from the rest of your network infrastructure, so there can't be any crosstalk between clients and the ability to, heaven forbid, access the network, the main enterprise network infrastructure. So we can tunnel to a separate gateway or gateway cluster and then firewall that off from the rest of the network. Maybe just allow only internet access or some kind of limited services for that specific traffic. As well as you can attach separate zones to separate VRFs for further L3 segmentation to maintain segmentation throughout the network.
Sorry,
yes,
there's one question here. Okay, the answer is right there. The question was, is there only one UBT zone per VRF?
Correct. It's one zone per VRF. The maximum number of zones is 8 in a switcher stack.
Thank you.
Yep. So for the downloadable gateway role, scale hasn't changed. It's still 1,017 tunnels per switcher stack, 256 tunnels per port. same as the authentication. Where the real meat is in the considerations that you need to have in using the downloadable gateway role. Currently, you have to use the Radius server IP instead of the fully qualified domain name. Fully qualified domain name support for the downloadable gateway role is planned in the next 10.6 CPE release, so 10.6.110. It does not work. Downloadable gateway roles do not work in parallel with downloadable switch roles. So if you have switch roles that are doing VNBT tunnels or switch roles that are doing local switching with VLANs, that won't work with the downloadable gateway role because we don't currently support what's called mixed mode or mixed role support. So that's coming in 10.8 with future 10.8 release. The downloadable gateway role only works with the VSAs that have been provided, which I'll show you in the demo. It's the Aruba UBT Gateway Zone VSA, as well as the Aruba UBT Gateway CPPM role VSA. So those are the two VSAs that we've introduced with ClearPass to use the downloadable gateway role. And it's supported on the 62, 63, and 6400 switches. If you need to use additional role attributes, PoE priority, VLAN assignment, you will have to use the standard Aruba switch VSAs for that you can find in the back of the security manual if you need to specify a VLAN or specify PoE priority or any of those other commands that you can get from the user role, the standard user role configuration context. So multi-zone, similar, came out in 10.6.100. It supports, scale hasn't changed. We still support 1,000 tunnels per system, but the scales I just mentioned is 1 zone per VRF, and the max number of zones supported is 8 across the switcher stack. One of the caveats there is to make sure we don't overlap user role VLAN. So if we have a specific VLAN, say VLAN 15 at one zone and VLAN 15 at the other zone, we need to be careful, especially if we're using something like the VLAN extend method, because then we're going to have the same VLAN on both zones and you're going to get cross-zone traffic, especially with broadcast or multicast traffic amongst that. So that's one thing to be aware of when using this. And multi-zone is only supported currently with the 6300 and 6400 switch series. So how this is configured, it hasn't changed much, of course, with user-based tunneling in general. First, we need to configure the switch for Radius. We need to enable authentication, either .1x or MACauth or both at the same time. Make sure we first enable that. Make sure we first enable that globally, as well as on the specific interface that we're going to be authenticating clients at. So the two new VSAs that we're using, there's actually 3. The third one is for a static role, but we have the Aruba-gateway-zone command, the Aruba-UBT-gateway-CPPM role command VSA, and then the Aruba UBT Gateway role VSA. So very similar to how we configure, roles and enforcement profiles. We need to make sure we have those VSAs in the role, in the enforcement profile that we're going to be downloading to the switch. So we have our logic and the enforcement policy, and then those VSAs must exist in the enforcement profile. So the gateway zone will indicate which zone we're going to use on the switch, so what zone that client traffic is going to use. So here I'm going to use my corporate zone, and if I look in my switch configuration, that would be my tunneling profile for the corporate zone and what VRF I'm using, which gateway IP I'm going to be tunneled to download either the gateway information or the cluster information. And then the UBT Gateway CPPM role VSA, that indicates the enforcement profile, which is the downloadable role that the gateway will download. And that would look like your standard downloadable role enforcement profile for the gateway. And then you configure your VLAN assignment and your policy as part of that enforcement profile. So then on the actual gateway itself, you need to make sure it's configured appropriately for Radius, that you're pointing to the Radius server, you have the Radius key, and then you need to make sure you have your ClearPass credentials that the gateway will use to log into ClearPass and download the role from. Some of the verifications for that, you always use the show port access clients command. One thing that's different, since we're using VSAs, the role will show up as a radius role, which indicates that VSAs are being used. So to validate it, you want to verify that the authentication was successful and that it received a radius response. And then we can actually go into that quote unquote radius role and look at the details of that and see that we have the appropriate gateway zone specified, as well as the gateway role that's being used to tunnel that client's traffic. Kind of a comparison between the two, both CX and AOS switch, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit different. In switch, we actually use the primary role or the switch user role to redirect the traffic to a VSA, and then we would specify the VSA with the enforcement profile, which is the downloadable role that the gateway will download. So in CX, we're doing it differently. We're just using a VSA to indicate the zone that client's traffic will be tunneled to, and then the role that will be downloaded to the gateway. For multi-zone configuration, we just simply can add another zone now into the tunneling profiles. So I have a second zone here that's configured and pointing to a separate gateway on a separate subnet. And then I have my main corporate zone that I'm using tunneling to my main cluster of gateways that I'm using. And then I can specify a separate VRF for that second zone. How we verify that, we use the show UBT state command. Of course, that shows whether our gateways are registered or not. That's what we're looking for if they're registered. If they're not registered, there's some things that we can do to figure out why these gateways aren't coming up as registered, such as check your licenses, check connectivity, make sure that the IP that we're pointing the switch to is the quote unquote controller IP for the controller IP command on the gateway. That makes sure that that can come up successfully. And of course, once those tunnels show up as registered, that's the control plane tunnel between the switch and the gateway. And then for the role itself, if we want to use downloadable roles, we can still use downloadable roles on the switch. We would just have to have a static role for the gateway role. But we just simply would put the zone in the gateway zone command for the switch user role. And if we're using a separate zone or multiple zones, we would just indicate that as part of the roles for those devices that will be tunneled to these separate zones. So the zone gateway zone command in a downloadable role is the one that's going to indicate which zones that the clients are going to be tunneled to. And if we're using the gateway downloadable role, that will be that VSA that I just showed you, will indicate the different zones that those tunnels will be going to. So the zone is what points to the different gateways for the multiple zones that client traffic will be using. So if you're designing some things you want to consider is which clients are going to tunnel to which zones are going to use which roles. So that would be something in the design that you want to plan for when doing that. Some of the validation for multi-zone at the gateway end is that you want to use the tunnel node manager tunnel nodes command that shows the switch tunnel, the control plane tunnel to each gateway. So you want to validate that the switch is up and that there is a tunnel between the switch and the gateway. We can see here I have the same switch being used here, but one's going over the 10.0 network, the other is going over the 10.5 network, and both of these are separate controllers, separate gateways. Some of the best practices we need to be considerate of is for the downloadable gateway role. So as I mentioned earlier, only use the radius IP. The fully qualified domain name currently is not supported until a future 10.6 release. The switch downloadable role is not supported in tandem with the downloadable gateway role, or what we're calling mixed mode or mixed role support. So those future enhancements will come in 10.8. For multi-zone, there's one zone per VRF supported. So multiple zones per VRF are not currently supported. And then you want to make sure each user role, if you're using the VLAN extend method, each user role on the same switch should have a separate VLAN tied to it. Otherwise, that could result in cross-zone traffic between the clients. So the list of troubleshooting commands I provided, I'll go through in the demo and show you these commands so you can actually see the output of them in real time. And we'll go through a couple of troubleshooting scenarios as well. with that, let's go ahead and jump into the demo here. Oops, there we go. Let's go into NetEdit. I have my network here set up in NetEdit. As we can see, indicated by my red tunnel here, I have control plane tunneling on my CX access switch here. That's being tunneled to my gateway cluster. If I wanted to validate my other gateways, I could merely type in the IP, and I could see here's my backup tunnel. So you saw my primary tunnel, there's my backup tunnel, and if I wanted to see my multi-zone, I can type that in as well. And for some reason, it's not coming up. And so then I need to, I'll have to do some troubleshooting here to figure out what's going on. So if I click on my switch here, I can actually scroll down in NetEdit, and I can see my health status here. So I see I have my second zone configured. It looks like it's up, but it's not started. I can see my other zone, my main zone, my corporate zone is registered, and it's showing up as registered. So I need to figure out what in the heck is going on here. So I can actually log in to my switch. Now if I do a show UBT, I can see both of these are enabled, but it's still not coming up. So if I do a show UBT state, that's pretty much similar to what we just saw over here in NetEdit. I still don't know what's going on. So the second thing, one of the main issues with the control plane not coming up, control plane tunnels not coming up, are down here with this IP source interface command. So I notice for my multiple zones, I don't have my other zone defined by a source interface. So I can add in my IP source interface command, and that is 10.0.1.100, and I'm going to go over my VRF1. So I need to add that source interface command in to make sure I can go to both zones. So now if I do a show UBT state, I can see I am now registered to my other gateway, and it's coming up. So some of the things you want to check for control plane, you make sure your control plane tunnels are up between the switch and the gateway. You want to check your licenses. You always want to make sure you have the appropriate, the AP licenses, at least the AP license on there. If you're going to use downloadable roles on the gateway, you need to make sure you have your PEF license and PEF enabled for the gateway role to enable user roles on the gateway. You also need to make sure that one, you have connectivity, that your gateway IP is configured as the controller IP command actually in the gateway, and that it's a physical IP, not a VIP, so that the switch can reach out to the gateways and then download either the cluster or the gateway information, and then it can form the control plane tunnels between that. And as we've mentioned in previous sessions and under the hoods, once the control plane is up between the switch and the gateways, as users come online, they will be tunneled across the cluster or to the gateway itself, and they will be on separate tunnels from the control plane. Let's go back and take a look at some of the things we can see here. So we showed and we proved out the control plane tunnels between the switch and the gateways. We can see that from the health status if we're running NetEdit. If we look at ClearPass, let's take a look at some of the different roles, how they look. So here is my downloadable gateway role that I'm using. So this client here is going over my corporate gateway zone, and then my downloadable gateway role is using the GW DIR Prof enforcement profile on ClearPass. So if I actually go into my enforcement profiles and look at that, I can actually see my role that I'm downloading. So go into the role configuration, I can configure my ACL. I just have an allow all ACL, but you put your policy here, your VLAN assignment here, captive portal, any of these other settings that you would need to use on the gateway role. And if you look at the summary, this is what's downloaded into the gateway. So I could go validate that on the gateway as well. So that's kind of how the downloadable gateway role works. We're using if I go and look at my enforcement profile, we'll have the gateway zone command. So if you're going to go to multiple zones, you'll use this command to indicate to which clients are going to go to which zone. And then you can also use a static gateway role using the Aruba-UBT gateway-role command. And that would be the role that exists statically that you'd have to configure on the gateway for it to work. So it works the same. It's a local gateway role. And you're just passing the name back to the gateway to make sure it matches. And of course, from the mobility master, you can log in the mobility conductor. You can log into that, and you can actually see the clients at the mobility conductor side. As we all know, if I go into my client view, we can actually see our clients that are being tunneled to each gateway, and then what downloadable role they're using, and then which switch they're downloading, which switch it's connected to, what role they're downloading. Get all the client information at your mobility conductor side. So let's take a look at some of the useful troubleshooting commands here. So on the switch, for both multi-zone and the gateway role command, because the gateway role command doesn't work unless your control plane tunnels are up. So the first thing you need to check is that your tunneling profiles are enabled at the switch. So if you're doing multiple zones, you want to make sure you have the appropriate configuration for both zones, that they're going to the appropriate IP address on on both the gateways. If you're using separate gateways, you want to make sure those are correct. The VRF is correct. If you're using the reserved VLAN or the local VLAN, that's the correct local VLAN. And then you want to make sure you have the tunneling profile enabled. Show UBT state commands we just covered. That shows if the gateways are registered or not. If they're registered, that means everything is good. If you have clients on board already, you'll see clients that are currently being tunneled across the gateways. Show UBT users. That indicates all the users that are coming from the switch, and if they're currently being tunneled, what role they're getting, if the tunnel's activated, what MAC address and what port they're using. Show UBT statistics. Will show the heartbeat statistics between the switch and the gateways. And you want to make sure that the packets are pretty even between transmit and receive. If you're not receiving anything, it usually indicates there's an issue that the control plane tunnels can't come up, whether it's a licensing issue, a configuration issue. That way you can go in and troubleshoot some more on that to figure out why tunnels aren't coming up. You can use debug commands to really get some more granular information on the heartbeats between the switch and the gateways. Show UBT information is the bucket map, the cluster map between the switch and the gateways, and the hashing of how all the users, what gateways they're going to be tunneled to across the bucket map. So you can go there and get an idea of which, how the clients will be balanced out across the gateways as you have multiple clients coming on board. Show UBT zone command. That will show you your zone configurations, similar to the show UBT command. Show UBT brief gives you a quick little table, shows you the mode that you're using, what the gateway address that you're being tunneled to, VRF, if it's enabled or not. Shows you the multiple zones on the gateway. My ace in the hole is always debug UBT. So I like to do debug UBT all, so I can see all the messages on there. But we can get down to the packet level. So you can do debug UBT packet. You can do it by the debug UBT hardware. So you can trace any hardware changes. You can do debug UBT CP. This will show you all the control plane information between the switch and the gateway. So if you can either debug to the screen or to a buffer, to a file. I like to go to the buffer, the debug buffer, because it keeps my screen from flooding, and it's fairly easy to manage. If you are outputting traffic to the debug buffer, you can actually do it by module. And a new command in 10.7 is that you can include your zone. You can actually include the zone and filter on the zone in the debug log. So that is a new command in there. Let's go. I think I need to go to actual one here, but you can actually include your zone in the command, and it'll show you all the debug information specific to the zone, so you can filter exactly on that zone and find out what's going on with that. So that's a new command in 10.7 for troubleshooting. Even before you get the, after you, well, you can do it before or after. After you get the control plane up between the switch and the gateways, you want to check that. But you also need to authenticate the clients to make sure they're getting onboarded appropriately. And so, of course, you want to get into your show port access commands. So we have the show port access client commands, which will show you a nice handy table of all your clients that are currently being authenticated. As you see, they get a radius assigned role, as I showed in the PowerPoint. I can copy that, and I can actually go into the role and get that. If I wanted to filter on radius, I could filter on all the radius roles or the downloadable roles from ClearPass. Or if I just wanted to get a specific role, I can do that as well. Name. Then that, and that'll actually show me my downloadable gateway role VSA information from there. So this is using my downloadable gateway VSA. So it's got my corporate zone and then my gateway role that's being downloaded to the gateway itself. You can get detail, of course, into your port access clients. If you wanted to look at a detail view, that'll show all the information specific to the client status at that port, what VLAN it's using, what the authentication details are, how long it's been on, what role it's getting, if the role's applied appropriately. If we're having issues with the role or the VSA, then you can turn on debug port access and get more information from that. So you can get granular with your port access. You can go by accounting, device profile, .1x, dynamic authorization, MAC authentication, policy, port security, radius, role, services. So you can select specific features or modules that you want to debug, or you can just do a debug port access all, and that'll give you all the messaging for that. And then once you turn on all that on, if you did a show debug buffer reverse and you're trying to find information on that, you're going to get a whole slew of information. So I have UBT turned on and I have port access turned on. So you can use the pipe to filter in for specific features. Some of the things you're going to be looking for when you're setting that up is, you're going to be looking for heartbeat responses. You're going to be looking for that, because it bootstraps between the switch and the gateways that's sending out packets. You want to make sure that it sends out a packet and receives a response, that the heartbeats are going between the switch and the gateway and nothing's blocking it. Otherwise, the gateways won't show up as registered when you enable the tunneling profile. So that's kind of the debugging process on the switch. Let's take a look at the gateway here. Oops. We'll log into this is the second zone gateway. Oops. Then we can run some commands over here. So some of the main ones for that, of course, you're probably familiar with these. The first one I like to check is the show tunnel node manager tunneled nodes. That's basically the control plane. These show the control plane information, basically the switch, so the switch can connect to the gateway and the tunneling is enabled between the two. So this is just a standalone gateway, but currently we see that the switch has an active tunnel between the gateway and the switch. Same command, we do tunneled users. currently I don't have any on this. I think they timed out. Let me go to my other one. And then we can see the tunnel information on my other gateway here. Change the font so a little bigger for you. There we go. So the tunneled users shows all the users for the gateway. Logging the mobility master. I'm going to copy paste the command here. There we go. So this one gateway only has a couple on it, but it's balanced out across my cluster here. But we can see from this command, this is the command that validates that your tunnels are up, your users' tunnels are up, that they have the proper VLAN assignment. You want to check the VLAN in parentheses because that's the actual VLAN assignment from the gateway role. The VLAN 3000 is the reserved VLAN. That doesn't have to exist on the gateway, it just has to exist on the switch. The gateway will automatically accept that. And then, that's just the mechanism by which all the tunnel traffic goes to the gateways. But the VLAN in parentheses is the actual VLAN assignment from the gateway role. So you can, if you have to get down to the MAC address on the users, you can do that and try to, if you need to troubleshoot specific issues with the user, it shows the MAC address of the user here and then all the appropriate information for that. Show data path tunnel table. This shows all the tunnels that are currently being tunneled to the gateway. So you can use the key here to decipher what kind of tunnels they are. I think we went over this a lot in the VLAN extend, our last session with 10.6, but you can see the main tunnel and the backup tunnels from using this command. So it's a very helpful command. Another helpful command is the show tunnel node manager trace buff. So this will give you your debug information from the switch to the gateway. I think if we go down here so we can see downloadable role, it'll give you your downloadable role information. So if your role is not downloading, you could find that here, information why it's not downloading. You'll also see your licensing information. So if you have the appropriate licenses on here, you would find that in this messages. Trying to find, I saw it earlier, there was some licensing. This will show if you have an invalid license or if your license is a success. So if you have invalid licenses, it will show up here. And if your control plane tunnels aren't showing up between the switch and the gateway, that would be one of the reasons, that could be one of the reasons why is licensing. So you could use this command to validate that. That being said, that about covers the new enhancements with UBT, and I hope this was beneficial for you.